In the chaos of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany from every direction, something vanished into the mists of history, something that would spawn decades of speculation, conspiracy theories, and obsessive searching by historians, researchers, and treasure hunters. An artifact known only as Die Glocke, the bell, and its mysterious archival trail remains one of the most debated and elusive questions in World War II historical investigation. Picture this. It's the spring of 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing, its grand ambitions reduced to rubble and ash. Yet in the shadow of this apocalyptic final chapter, whispers persist about a technological marvel so extraordinary, so paradigm-shattering, that some would spend the rest of their lives chasing ghosts and reconstructing legends from fragmented testimony and speculative evidence. The story begins, as so many wartime mysteries do, not with a eureka moment or a dramatic discovery, but with absence, the conspicuous absence of documentation, the empty space where records should be, and the human tendency to fill that void with imagination and inference. In 1997, Polish-American journalist and author Igor Witkowski published Truth About the Wunderwaffe, claiming to have interviewed a former SS officer named Jakob Sporenberg, who, allegedly, divulged the existence of Die Glocke, described as a bell-shaped device some 15 feet in diameter, constructed from a metallic alloy of unknown composition, capable of generating a field of some kind, built in the Breslau area during the Nazi regime's final years, potentially intended as a secret weapon of apocalyptic proportions. But here is where the historical record becomes crucial. Witkowski's claims, while sensational and widely disseminated through popular media and internet culture, have never been substantiated by any credible documentary evidence, by any Nazi records housed in archives across Europe and America, by any testimonies corroborated, by multiple independent sources, or by any physical artifact that has ever been recovered, examined, or verified by legitimate scientists. The archives of Europe tell a different story, or rather, they tell the story of the absence of such a device, the careful documentation of Nazi scientific projects that were grandiose and ambitious, but ultimately rooted in conventional physics and engineering, however twisted and weaponized those disciplines became under totalitarian direction. When we turn to what the actual archives really show, we find something far more complex and historically significant than the Die Glocke legend itself. We find the meticulously preserved records of genuine Nazi scientific ambitions, the documented reality of secret weapons programs that ranged from advanced but ultimately unsuccessful jet aircraft to rockets and experimental weapons, all of which are thoroughly cataloged in the records kept at the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, the German Resistance Memorial Center, and numerous other repositories. The legend of Die Glocke arose in a specific historical and cultural moment. The post-Cold War era, when declassified documents about Nazi science became more accessible, when the Internet enabled rapid dissemination of sensational claims, when a hunger for hidden history collided with a narrative vacuum that could be filled with speculation. The actual archival record reveals that Nazi Germany did indeed pursue numerous technological innovations. The Messerschmitt Me 262. The first jet-powered fighter aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb, which saw operational use, the V-2 rocket, which achieved significant technical sophistication, experimental turbine engines, research into radar technology, and numerous other projects documented in bureaucratic detail across thousands of surviving Nazi records, memoranda, and correspondence. These records, painstakingly translated and analyzed by historians for decades, paint a picture of a regime that invested enormous resources into science and technology, that recruited brilliant minds from across Europe, that attempted to weaponize every theoretical advance available to their engineers. And yet these documented programs, as remarkable as some of them were, operated entirely within the bounds of known physics and conventional engineering principles, however unconventional their ultimate applications. The archival evidence from Nazi institutions shows that while there were certainly ambitious theoretical research programs, while there were indeed scientists exploring cutting-edge concepts in fields ranging from atomic physics to aerodynamics, there is no documentary trace whatsoever of the sophisticated, world-altering technology that Die Glocke legend describes. What the records actually show is something even more illuminating about the human condition. They demonstrate how uncertainty transforms into mythology, how the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence deliberately erased, how the human mind fills historical gaps with narrative that feels true, even when documentation cannot support it. Igor Witkowski's source, Jakob Sporenberg, was real. He was indeed an SS officer who survived the war and lived in occupied Poland, but his account was never corroborated by a single peer, was never confirmed by documentation, was never verified through cross-reference with other prisoner testimonies. And indeed, many of his specific claims about his own wartime activities have been questioned by historians who examined actual records. The archival approach reveals something profound: the distinction between historical mystery and historical invention, between gaps in documentation that indicate genuine secrets and gaps that indicate absence of substance. Consider the contrast. When historians examine documentation about German atomic research, they find clear evidence of a real program, with funding records, facility documentation, correspondence between key scientists, experimental notes, and a clear narrative of why this program ultimately failed to produce a working weapon. It's documented, traceable, verifiable, even though the atomic weapons were never built. In the case of Die Glocke, we find none of these archival markers. We find instead silence, absence, and one unverified anecdotal account by a single individual decades after the war, with no supporting documentation, no collaborative evidence, no contemporary records from any Nazi institution suggesting such a project existed. The archives show that Nazi Germany's scientific administration, while chaotic in some respects, maintained remarkably detailed records of major projects, budgets, personnel, and objectives, making it virtually inconceivable that a project as massive as Die Glocke legend describes could have existed without leaving some documentary trace in this vast paper trail. Furthermore, the historical archives demonstrate that in the post-war period, both American and Soviet intelligence services conducted extensive searches for Nazi technological secrets, capturing documents, interviewing scientists, and establishing that while Nazi science was in some cases sophisticated, it was not fundamentally ahead of Allied capabilities in most respects, and certainly not in the ways that Die Glocke mythology suggests. The intelligence reports generated during Operation Paperclip, the American program to identify, relocate, and employ Nazi scientists after the war, provide extensive documentation of German scientific achievements and failures. And nowhere in these comprehensive assessments, compiled by scientists and engineers tasked with evaluating German technology, does Die Glocke appear as a serious concern or a confirmed project. What emerges when examining the archival record with scholarly rigor is not a suppressed truth, but a fascinating case study. How historical narratives form in the absence of evidence, how popular culture and internet mythology can overwhelm documentary reality, and how the legitimate historical investigation of Nazi science can become distorted through sensationalism and unverified claims. The actual records do show remarkable things about Nazi scientific ambition and failure. They show ambitious plans for orbital weapons platforms that existed only in theoretical memoranda. They show cutting-edge research in fields like rocketry and aeronautics that pushed technical boundaries. They show the waste of enormous resources on projects like the Maw's super heavy tank that never saw combat. They show the regime's desperate pursuit of any technological edge that might reverse its deteriorating military position as the war progressed toward inevitable defeat. These documented realities are themselves dramatic and historically significant, and they tell us something important about how authoritarianism and pseudoscience intersect, about how regimes in crisis can pour resources into increasingly speculative and unlikely solutions, about how the absence of democratic constraints on resource allocation led to profound inefficiencies and wasted potential. The archival evidence about genuine Nazi scientific programs reveals decisions driven by ideology as much as by physics, by the regime's pathological worldview and racial theories that influence scientific direction and personnel choices, by the elimination of Jewish scientists and other persecuted groups that certainly hampered German scientific progress in some fields. These documented consequences of Nazi ideology are themselves grave and illuminating historical lessons without requiring any invocation of speculative superweapons that leave no archival trace. The Die Glocke phenomenon itself, the way the legend emerged, spread, and persisted despite lack of evidence, becomes a valuable historical artifact in its own right, one that tells us about post-Cold War anxieties, about internet culture and how information spreads in digital age, about the human psychological tendency to believe that hidden explanations must exist for ambiguous events and unclear outcomes. The archives also contain something that Die Glocke mythology often obscures: the actual voices of Nazi scientists, their own accounts of their work, their own assessments of what was possible, what was attempted, and what ultimately proved unattainable given the technological constraints of the era. When these scientists, captured by Allied forces and questioned extensively, made no mention of Die Glocke, when they described their genuine achievements and genuine failures in documented interviews and testimony, they painted a picture of a scientific establishment that was advanced in certain respects, but fundamentally limited by mid-20th century physics and engineering, constrained by the regime's own priorities and ideologies, and ultimately unable to produce the revolutionary technologies that Nazi ideology promised. The historical record preserved in archives shows that one reason the Die Glocke legend became so persistent is precisely because it offered an explanation for Germany's defeat that bypassed uncomfortable historical reality, rather than confronting how a sophisticated technological establishment, given unlimited resources and ruthless disregard for human rights, still ultimately failed because it was operating under authoritarian leadership driven by pseudo-scientific ideology. The legend proposes that Germany actually possessed world-altering technology, but it was either suppressed, lost, or captured by victorious powers. This narrative, while dramatically satisfying, does not align with what the extensive archival record actually demonstrates. The archives contain the bureaucratic reality of Nazi Germany, the competition between agencies, the duplication of effort, the ideological interference in scientific selection and direction, the documented failures of various weapons programs, the contemporary correspondence showing awareness of technological gaps relative to Allied capabilities, the desperation of the final years converted into increasingly speculative technical proposals, many of which exist only as paper studies, because they could never be built with available materials and technology. What the archival record truly shows about Die Glocke is the absence of evidence, and the historical importance of recognizing that absence, of distinguishing between genuine historical mysteries that leave traces and legendary inventions that exist only in testimony disconnected from documentation. This distinction matters deeply for understanding how history is constructed, how evidence is evaluated, how speculation becomes mythology, and how popular culture can overwhelm documentary fact in the public consciousness. The archives show that serious historians, Those who have spent careers examining Nazi scientific programs have consistently found Die Glocke to be unsubstantiated, a story that emerges from post-war interviews rather than from the vast documentary record that Nazi bureaucracy left behind. The records further show that subsequent searches for Die Glocke, including expeditions to alleged locations in Poland where it was supposedly hidden, have yielded nothing but speculation and wishful thinking. No artifacts, no confirming evidence, no documentary traces despite the accessibility of archives and the extensive efforts of researchers motivated by both genuine historical interest and commercial opportunity. What the real archives reveal about Nazi secret weapons programs is that while several such programs did exist and were documented, they ranged from the moderately successful to the spectacularly unsuccessful, from the Me-262 jet fighter that came too late to alter the war's outcome, to the V-2 rocket that was, technically, sophisticated but strategically ineffective, to numerous other projects that consumed resources without producing operational weapons, or that existed only as theoretical concepts. The documented record shows a scientific establishment capable of impressive technical achievements, but ultimately constrained by ideology, by resource limitations despite the regime's totalitarian control of German industry, by the brain drain of persecution, by geographic and industrial destruction as the war progressed, and by fundamental physical and engineering limitations that no amount of Nazi ideology could overcome. In conclusion, the archives really show something more valuable than the mythological Die Glocke. They show the actual contours of Nazi scientific ambition and failure, the documented reality of a technologically sophisticated but ideologically compromised regime attempting to weaponize cutting-edge science in service of genocidal expansion and authoritarian control, and the ultimate triumph of historical documentation over speculative mythology when we approach evidence with scholarly rigor. The lesson of Die Glocke as an archival question is that absence of evidence in a documentary record as voluminous as that left by Nazi Germany must be taken seriously. That mythological narratives which emerge from single unverified sources decades after events deserve skepticism no matter how dramatic they are, and that the documented reality of how science was used and misused under totalitarianism provides sufficient historical drama and moral weight without requiring invention. The archival record stands as testament to the power of documentation and the responsibility of historians to distinguish between what evidence demonstrates and what speculation proposes, between mystery and mythology, between the genuine technological achievements and genuine failures of a dark historical period and the legends that subsequently attach themselves to historical gaps and uncertainties.